Shadows of Guadalcanal. The jungle was never silent. Even at night, it felt alive, like it was breathing. Insects buzzed, leaves rustled, and somewhere in the distance, the faint splash of a river whispered through the thick, choking air. The darkness wasn't just around us. It was within us, a weight that clung to every man like the sweat on our backs. I can still feel it sometimes, even now. The shadows of Guadalcanal weren't just in the trees. They were in our heads, in our hearts, and they've never truly left. I remember the first time I set foot on that cursed island. August of 1942. The heat hit me like a punch to the gut the moment I stepped off the Higgins boat. The air was thick, almost syrupy, and the smell, God, the smell. It was a cocktail of salt, rot, and something I couldn't quite place but would later recognize as fear. Not mine, not yet. But it was there, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. We were kids. Most of us hadn't seen our 25th birthday yet. Sure, we'd been through boot camp, but nothing could prepare you for this. The jungle was a different kind of enemy. It was patient, relentless, and unforgiving. You could feel its eyes on you, even when you knew there was no one there. At least, not yet. The Japanese soldiers, we called them the Ghosts, knew this place better than we ever could. They moved through the jungle like shadows, silent and unseen until it was too late. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made your heart skip a beat. You'd lie awake at night, clutching your rifle, straining to hear the sound of footsteps over the constant drone of insects. It wasn't just a battle for territory. It was a battle for sanity. Our first firefight happened on the second day. We were advancing through a patch of jungle, so dense you could barely see 10 feet ahead. The guy in front of me, Danny Marks from Indiana, turned to say something, but before he could get a word out, there was a flash, a crack, and he was gone. Just like that. 1 second he was there, and the next, all that was left was a smear of blood and the echo of a gunshot. It was chaos after that. Gunfire erupted all around us, but we couldn't see where it was coming from. The jungle swallowed the sound, bouncing it off trees and vines until it felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. We dropped to the ground, firing blindly into the green abyss, our hearts pounding out of our chests. When it was over, there was silence again. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that pressed down on you, heavy and oppressive. We lost 4 men that day. 4 lives snuffed out in a heartbeat. And for what? A few more feet of jungle? Better position? It didn't feel real. Not then, anyway. That night, as we sat around a small, flickering fire, the reality of it started to sink in. The faces of the men we'd lost haunted us, their laughter and voices still fresh in our minds. But there was no time to grieve. We were Marines. We had a job to do, and morning would have to wait. The nights were the worst. The jungle came alive after dark, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. You'd hear whispers in the wind, low and guttural, like the jungle itself was mocking you. Sleep was a luxury we couldn't afford, not when the ghosts were out there, watching, waiting. One night, while on watch, I saw something I'll never forget. The moon was high, casting a pale, eerie light over the jungle. I was scanning the perimeter when I noticed a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was too far to make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me. I raised my rifle, my finger hovering over the trigger, but something stopped me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I didn't tell anyone about it. Part of me thought I'd imagined it, a trick of the light or my mind playing games with me. But deep down, I knew it was real. I could feel it in my gut. By the end of that first week, we were different men. The jungle had a way of stripping you down to your core, exposing every fear, every weakness. You learned to move quietly, to blend into the shadows, to become part of the jungle. It was the only way to survive. But even as we adapted, the ghosts were always one step ahead. They knew every inch of that island, every hiding spot, every ambush point. And they were patient. They didn't need to fight us head on. They just needed to wear us down, to let the jungle do most of the work. We started to see things differently. The jungle wasn't just a place. It was a character in this twisted play we were all part of. It was alive, and it was hungry. You could feel it in the way the vines seemed to reach for you, in the way the shadows shifted when there was no breeze. It wasn't just the Japanese we were fighting. It was the island itself. And yet, there were moments of beauty amidst the chaos. The way the light filtered through the canopy, turning the leaves a brilliant shade of green. The sound of a distant waterfall, soothing and constant. It was a cruel irony, really, how something so beautiful could be so deadly. As the days turned into weeks, we began to question everything. Why were we here? What were we fighting for? The answers didn't come easily, and when they did, they weren't the ones we wanted to hear. But there was no turning back. Not now. Not ever. The jungle wasn't just a place we fought. It became the battleground inside us. You could see it in the eyes of the men. There was something hollow there, a flicker of who they'd been before. Guadalcanal didn't just take our brothers. It reached into us, pulling away pieces of our souls, leaving behind ghosts of its own. A week in, the rain started. Not a drizzle, but a relentless downpour that turned the earth into a sucking, stinking swamp. Our boots were never dry, and our skin grew raw where the wet leather chafed. The rain drowned out the sound of everything except our own thoughts, and sometimes that was worse than the silence. You'd sit there in the mud, clutching your rifle, and the memories would creep in, Danny's blood on your face, the way the jungle went quiet just before an ambush, the faces of the men who didn't make it to the next roll call. There was one moment that stuck with me, like a splinter lodged deep under the skin. We were advancing through a stretch of jungle known as Bloody Ridge. The name wasn't official, but it fit like a glove. The ridge had already swallowed up 2 companies before us, and we were the next in line. The trees here were gnarled and twisted, their roots clawing at the earth like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a sickly sweet stench that clung to your nostrils and refused to let go. As we climbed, the sound of the rain softened. It didn't stop, it never really stopped, but it felt muted, like the ridge itself was holding its breath. That's when we heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, we thought it was just the rain against the leaves, but it was too deliberate, too patterned. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, tap, pause. We froze, every muscle in our bodies screaming to move, to run, to do anything but stand there like sitting ducks. The tapping grew louder, closer, and then it stopped. Dead silence. The kind that makes your ears ring because your brain can't process the absence of sound. That's when the first scream tore through the air. It wasn't one of ours. It came from somewhere ahead, deep in the jungle. It was high-pitched, desperate, like the sound a rabbit makes when it's caught in a snare. We didn't move. We didn't even breathe. Then came another scream and another, until it was a chorus of agony, echoing through the trees. And just like that, it was gone. We found the source an hour later. Or what was left of it. A Japanese patrol had been torn apart, their bodies scattered across the ridge like broken toys. The jungle was eerily quiet again, as if it were watching us, waiting to see what we'd do. There were no bullet wounds, no signs of a firefight. Just blood. Blood and something that looked like claw marks, but no animal could have done this. At least, none I'd ever heard of. We didn't talk about it. What was there to say? We buried what we could, said a quick prayer, and moved on. But the shadows seemed darker after that, and the air heavier. The ridge didn't feel like a place anymore. It felt like a thing, a living, breathing entity that had claimed its victims and was hungry for more. That night, I dreamed of Danny. He was standing at the edge of the jungle, his face pale and his uniform soaked with blood. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with those hollow eyes. When I woke up, the air in my tent felt wrong, like I wasn't alone. I grabbed my rifle and stepped outside, scanning the shadows, but there was nothing there, just the jungle watching. By the 3rd week, the sickness had started to set in. The heat and the rain were a breeding ground for every kind of infection you could imagine, and some you couldn't. Malaria, dysentery, jungle rot, you name it, we had it. Men who'd been strong and sure of themselves were reduced to hollow shells, their bodies wasting away as the jungle feasted on them from the inside out. And yet, we kept going. What choice did we have? The nights were the hardest. The ghosts of the jungle weren't just the Japanese anymore. They were the men we'd lost, the friends we couldn't save. Sometimes you'd hear them whispering in the wind, calling your name, and for a split second, you'd believe it was real. You'd stand up, rifle in hand, ready to follow the sound, only to realize you were chasing shadows. One night, while on watch, I saw something or someone. It was just a flicker, a silhouette moving through the trees. I thought it was a Japanese scout, so I followed, keeping low and quiet. The figure moved quickly, almost too quickly, slipping through the underbrush like a wisp of smoke. It wasn't until I got closer that I realized something was off. The figure wasn't carrying a weapon. It wasn't even wearing a uniform. It looked old, frail, like a man who'd been here long before the war began. He turned to face me, and I swear for a moment our eyes met. They weren't the eyes of a soldier. They were ancient, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Sadness, maybe, or wisdom. He raised a hand, pointing towards something behind me, and then he was gone. I turned, and there it was. An old, weathered shrine, half buried in the jungle. It wasn't on any map we'd been given, and there was no reason for it to be here, miles from any village or road. The air around it felt different, heavier somehow, like the weight of centuries was pressing down on that one spot. I wanted to leave, to get as far away from that shrine as possible, but something held me there, something I couldn't explain. When I got back to camp, I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. Not because I didn't think they'd believe me, hell, half the men were seeing things by then, but because it felt like something I needed to keep to myself. Like a secret the jungle had shared with me and me alone. The next day, we were ordered to push further into enemy territory. The tension in the air was thicker than the humidity, and every man knew what it meant. Not all of us were coming back. As we moved out, I couldn't shake the feeling that the jungle was watching us, not as an enemy, but as something more. Something ancient. There's a moment in every man's life when he realizes he's not coming back. I don't mean dying. I mean knowing deep in your gut that you've left a part of yourself somewhere, and it's never going to follow you home. That moment came for me on the 4th week in Guadalcanal. The orders were clear. Hold the line. It didn't matter that we were outnumbered, outgunned, and barely holding on to reality. The Japanese were mounting a counterattack, and our position on that godforsaken ridge was the only thing keeping them from retaking the airfield. We were the thin green line between the enemy and what little ground we'd clawed out of the jungle. The first attack came at dusk. They came out of the trees like shadows, silent and swift. There was no yelling, no battle cries, just the cold efficiency of men who'd done this 100 times before. We opened fire, the sound of our rifles tearing through the thick, humid air. The jungle lit up in flashes, and for a moment, I saw their faces, young, determined, afraid. Just like us. The fighting was brutal, chaotic. The ridge was a nightmare of mud and blood, the air thick with smoke and the screams of the dying. I lost count of how many times I fired my rifle, how many times I reloaded, my hands shaking and slick with sweat. Every time we thought we'd push them back, they came again, wave after wave, relentless as the tide. And then the night came. The jungle at night was a different beast, and fighting in it was like battling your own nightmares. The shadows seemed to move on their own, darting between the trees and blending into the blackness. You'd hear the crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, and then nothing. Your own breath felt deafening in your ears, your heart pounding like a drum. We held the line, but just barely. By the time dawn broke, the ridge was littered with bodies, ours and theirs. The stench was unbearable, a sickening mix of blood, sweat, and rot. Flies buzzed in thick clouds, and the jungle seemed to drink it all in, as if it were feeding on our suffering. That morning, I found myself back at the shrine. I don't remember walking there, but somehow I was standing in front of it again. The air around it was still heavy, almost suffocating, but there was something else now. A feeling I couldn't shake, like the shrine was trying to tell me something. The carvings on the stone were faded, worn away by time and weather, but I could still make out the shapes of faces, dozens of them etched into the rock. They weren't human, not entirely. Their features were sharp, almost bird-like, with wide staring eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. I don't know why I did it, but I knelt in front of the shrine and closed my eyes. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was madness. Or maybe it was something else, something older than any of us. I whispered a prayer, not to God, but to whatever was listening. To the jungle. To the shadows. To the ghosts. When I opened my eyes, the jungle was quiet. Not silent, but a calmer. The tension that had been suffocating us for weeks seemed to lift, just slightly. I stood there for a long time, staring at the shrine, before finally making my way back to camp. The final attack came 3 days later. By then, there were barely enough of us left to form a proper line. Most of the men were sick or wounded, and those who weren't looked like walking corpses. But we fought anyway, because that's what we did. That's what we had to do. The Japanese came at us with everything they had: artillery, mortars, infantry. The ridge shook under the force of the bombardment, and the air was so thick with smoke you could barely see your own hand in front of your face. We were holding on by a thread, and everyone knew it. And then something changed. The jungle, which had been our enemy for so long, seemed to come alive. The ground trembled, the trees swayed, and a low guttural sound filled the air, like the growl of some ancient beast. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw the looks on the faces of the men around me. They heard it too. The Japanese soldiers hesitated, their advance faltering as they looked around, confused and frightened. And then the jungle erupted. I don't know how to describe what happened next. It was chaos, pure and unrelenting. The shadows seemed to move on their own, lashing out at the enemy with an almost feral intensity. Men screamed, ours and theirs, as the jungle swallowed them whole. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes, mud, blood, the sound of gunfire echoing through the trees. And then silence. When I came to, the sun was rising. The ridge was empty, the bodies of the Japanese soldiers gone. The jungle had taken them, claimed them as its own. I don't know why it spared us. Maybe it was the shrine. Maybe it was something else. We were pulled off the ridge the next day, replaced by fresh troops who hadn't yet learned to fear the jungle. As the boat pulled away from the shore, I looked back one last time. The jungle was still there, silent and watchful, its secrets buried deep within the shadows. I don't talk about Guadalcanal much these days. Most people wouldn't understand. They think war is about glory, about heroes and villains. But the truth is, war is just a place. A place that takes and takes until there's nothing left. And Guadalcanal, it wasn't just a place. It was a predator. I left a part of myself there, on that ridge in those shadows. And sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I can still feel it calling to me, whispering my name, like the wind through the trees. Maybe one day I'll go back, but not today. Not yet.